Hi there, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report, and a lot going on, Stacy.
Right. Well, I want to talk about the banality of monetary evil because, there's a piece out by Matt Taibbi in his Substack, and it is reminding me of a very Graham Greene sort of depiction of what we see at the center of the imperial rot, whether it's in the US or Canada or the UK or any of the other sort of Five Eyes nations, as their monetary policy and money disintegrates. And here's the headline first. When boring people turn dangerous, Canada's insane power grab, the Canadian government's decision to freeze bank accounts, which have now been unfrozen, but in the trucker protests is a mad leap toward bureaucratic dystopia.
Yeah, I read the piece, and he does a good job kind of delving into this whole idea that bored housewives get vicious. And so the Canadian nation is a nation of bored housewives run by Justin Trudeau, the ultimate bored housewife. And when they get angry, boy, woo! I mean, he's a Karen. It's a nation of Karens, for the most part, except for maybe the Toronto Maple Leafs. But this nation is showing signs of Karen extremism, which I think is probably the most dangerous form of terrorism in the world.
Well, in fact, they've started to expand the definition, of course, of terrorism and terrorists, and it includes more and more ordinary citizens, as had been warned about back in 2001, 2003, 2005, 2006. Like, if anybody was around blogging back then, you would have remembered that, of course, the likes of Glenn Greenwald were warning people that all these laws would be expanded. But I want to point out something from the article. Matt Taibbi reads a transcript from a court case where the husband of the woman who has organized, was one of the lead organizers of this protest. He is being questioned by a judge about his participation. And this, to me, is the most extraordinary, because a lot of the people around nations around the world and citizens of those nations around the world, in particular, I would say the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they kind of assume that because they're such close allies with America and they speak the same language, that they have the same rights as Americans, that they have the First Amendment right, but they don't. Here it is. CBC described a confrontation at the hearing for this woman when Litch's husband, Dwayne, made the mistake of citing an American rights concept to the incredibly named Judge Julie Bourgeois. Quote, "Honestly, I thought it was a peaceful protest," he told the court, "and based on my First Amendment, I thought that was part of our rights." "What do you mean, First Amendment? What's that?" Judge Julie Bourgeois asked him. Quote, "I don't know. I don't know politics. I don't know," he said. "I wasn't supportive of the blockade or the whatever, but I didn't realize that it was criminal to do what they were doing. I thought it was part of our freedoms to be able to do stuff like that."
Right. Well, Canada is a Commonwealth country, like Australia, and of course, Great Britain. And a lot of times people say, you have free speech in Britain. And that's false. And let me explain why. Ultimately, I'll make the ultimate case for this. So apparently there's a Human Rights Act of 1998, which codifies speech in the UK. Point number one, it says everyone has the right to freedom of expression. Sounds good so far, right?
Sounds good to me.
Point number two, the exercise of these freedoms, since it carries with it duties and responsibilities, may be subject to such formalities, conditions, restrictions, penalties that are prescribed by law and are necessary in a democratic society in the interest of national security, territorial integrity, or public safety, for the prevention or disorder of crime, for the protection of health or morals, for the protection of reputation or rights of others, for preventing the disclosure of information received in confidence, or by maintaining the authority and impartiality of the judiciary. Okay, so this is the most British thing I've seen in 20 years. You have the right to free expression in Britain, unless you try to freely express yourself, in which case you're violating the law and you can go to prison. There is no free speech in Britain. There is no free speech in Canada. There is no free free speech in Australia because they are Commonwealth countries ruled over by a monarch, for Christ's sake.
Well, the monarchy, you're a subject in these countries. So, let's move on to the rest of the story here, because Chrystia Freeland is kind of mocked, you might say, by Matt Taibbi in this piece. And he actually worked with Chrystia Freeland in the 1990s in Russia, post-collapse of the Soviet Union. So he knows her quite well. But he mentions that the Emergencies Act contains language beyond the inventive powers of the best sci-fi writers. It defines a, quote, designated person, a person eligible for cutoff of financial services, as someone directly or indirectly participating in a public assembly that may reasonably be expected to lead to a breach of the peace. Directly or indirectly, he asks? She went on to describe the invocation of the Canada's Emergency Act in the dripping fake tones of someone trying to put a smile on an insurance claim rejection, with even phrases with bad news steered upward in the form of cheery hypotheticals, as in, the names of both individuals and entities as well as crypto wallets have been shared by the RCMP with financial institutions, and accounts have been frozen, as she intoned in an asking-like way. As she confirmed this monstrous news about freezing bank accounts, Freeland burst into nervous laughter, looking like Tony Perkins sharing a cheery memory with Mother.
From Psycho?
Yes.
Well, I often ask the question, is Bitcoin causing the chaos or reacting to the chaos? Because with Bitcoin, if you're self-custodying your Bitcoin, no state can get at it. No individual can get at it. You have individual sovereignty. And I think the global elite, that concept, now that they understand that the plebs have individual sovereignty and they can't get their Bitcoin, they're driving them insane. This woman literally has become a character from the movie Psycho. And as I've said, Bitcoin is a mirror. If you're inclined to be a psychopath, it'll show you as a psychopath. If you're inclined to be more noble and have aspirations toward the greater good, like Najib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, it accentuates what is already there. It's a mirror. Matter of fact, I said those exact words to President Bukele in his office a week ago, and he was fascinated by this concept, as well as some other things I imparted as the high priest of Bitcoin about how Bitcoin demonetizes violence, etc. You can get my book, The Book of Max. Okay. It's all in my book.
Okay. Let's return to this episode. But the point is that I was mentioning the banality of evil, a concept, of course, first named by Hannah Arendt. But, Graham Greene often had this sort of concept throughout his books, his entertainments, as he called them, whereby you had this decaying empire. The stories he told, the British Empire at the time, and just the decay and the rot that he would see around him in these developing world nations, these third world countries where they were presiding over. So the banality of evil, the characters were often evil, the good American, about Vietnam. They were totally banal, they were totally ordinary, and yet committed heinous acts of evil, really, by subjugating these people. And he framed his worldview through Catholicism. He was very Catholic. With Bitcoin, the thing is, the protocol is moral. It imposes justice on a system that is immoral, and that's why you're seeing it exposed, and it is exposing the banality of the monetary evil around us. This money that was never your money that is not your wealth, money that you're working for hard every single day, and you have no idea that it's actually not your money. It's a total deception. And now we have things like actual, the banality is a little bit more aggressive in that we have very high inflation of 7.5% officially here in the United States, for example, but interest rates down at 2%. So you have real negative interest rates, right? So that's repression. It's called financial repression. It was outlined by the IMF a few years ago. This is doing the rounds on Bitcoin Twitter, where they're showing that this was their plan by design of how to financially repress your population through the banality of monetary evil.
Right. So Bitcoin is a moral paradigm and enforces this morality by collectively attacking the human subconscious and unconscious mind as it relates to money. And money has always been the primary means in which humans communicate. It's global, it's universal, and it it's part of our DNA. So this imposition on the globe of a moral, aesthetically perfect money, the Sistine Chapel of money and beyond the Sistine Chapel of money, has driven those who have a tendency toward evil to completely have mental breakdowns, as the woman described in Matt Taibbi's piece.
Yes. And, you know, in terms of that banality of evil and what we're starting to see now, that it's not so banal and it's not so mild, and you're starting to see the actual freezing and theft, the confiscation of wealth from citizens, or at least the blocking of their access to their own wealth, at least for a period of time in which they can't eat and heat their home or pay their rent, is the same sort of thing, what I'm saying with the banality of evil, in which Graham Greene described. What you saw was, you know, these imperialist people like trying to rule over this third world country. And when they couldn't control the situation or the culture or the desires of the locals, like this is when you saw all the evil moments. And this is when you're seeing the evil moments right now today, geopolitically, but also monetarily and culturally in the West. There's something going on. Everybody can see it. Matt Taibbi keeps writing about it, that the left, the liberal, they're having some sort of cultural breakdown where they can't persuade the people to believe in what they believe. So they're turning from benign sort of like, hey, we're like hipsters culturally, like interesting, and to like authoritarian and vicious.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question again, does Bitcoin cause the chaos, or is it reacting to the chaos? I would posit, and I have so for many years, that it's causing the chaos for this very reason. It's sublimely, morally, aesthetically perfect. And that is driving those who have a tendency toward evil to expose themselves. And they are suffering, and they will suffer a great deal. Those without the Bitcoin shall inherit a whirlwind of pain.
And you see that everywhere, all around you. You see like just a better money comes along, and it's the better money that exposes the weak money. A better content creator comes along and they expose the mainstream sort of corporate dreary media for the dreck they are.
That's it. Well, speaking of pain, we'll be back after this message. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Craig Hemke of TFMetalsReport.com. Craig, welcome back.
Max, always good to see you, my friend.
All righty. Your 2022 forecast was titled Reality Bites. It sure does. We'll get into some of the predictions, but let's start with war and a geopolitical conflict. It's the end of the unipolar world, some are saying. Are we in a more volatile times going forward, Craig?
Well, it's funny you reference that forecast. I wrote that, as I always do, back in the first part of January, Max. And I wrote, one of the things that's come true is I said, this is going to be a wildly unpredictable and volatile year. So far, so good on that part, at least. Oh my gosh. You know, you and I have discussed this multiple times over the years. I've been following the situation in Ukraine and with Russia since this time 8 years ago. It's amazing. It's been 8 years, but you know, the whole Maidan revolution, if you will, took place at this time in 2014. In fact, I was doing interviews about a week ago telling people that the main dates to watch were probably the 21st and 22nd, because the 21st is the day that Ukraine celebrates all of those events. And, you know, Putin has a history of kind of, you know, noticing and anniversaries and birthdays and doing things, you know, for, I guess, symbolism on certain dates. So the fact that all this took place on the 21st in the end wasn't really very surprising. And now we'll see where it goes from here. I suspect, Max, there may be kind of an uneasy de-escalation from here. We'll see if that gets priced in the short term. But in the longer term, all this stuff about sanctions, you know, possibly making moves to exclude Russia from the SWIFT system. I mean, all of that stuff is really dollar bearish. And I don't know if that's even being discussed yet.
Right. Well, part of that dollar bearishness would be the end of a unipolar world. So U.S. dollar as world reserve currency, this looks like the end of that era, and we're entering into a multipolar world. And what's interesting is that the Russian officials have said, when asked about the sanctions, they've said pretty bluntly, we don't really care. You know, we've already sanctioned us down to a level where there's no more to do. And also, if you want to start getting serious, we're just going to go to Bitcoin, is how I read it, kind of the subtext there, Craig.
Yeah, no, why wouldn't they? I mean, it's so typical American head in the sand, you know, think that we just control everybody and they'll just do whatever we say. And what was it, just a week or two ago, there was an energy deal announced between Russia and China where they're going to base the trade in euros. And again, all of this is to be expected. I mean, why would anyone comply with, you know, this kind of rules-based order? You're going to follow your own rules, whatever you think is right for your own country, not just what the U.S. says. And so this is all totally expected. And yeah, it'll be very interesting to see where it goes from here. That Bitcoin part you mentioned, that's certainly something that we should watch. And, you know, and Russia's been accumulating gold for decades as well. And they've almost sold off all their treasuries now. And what are they down to? Not even $100 billion, I think, in the last, or maybe less than that, if not all of it, in the last tick data. So, yeah, this is all part of the brave new world, if you will, all part of that wildly unpredictable 2022 that we've got on our hands.
Yep, absolutely. Russia sold down all their U.S. treasuries pretty much. They've been loading up on gold for a long, long time. And you talk about dates and symbolism. I think, you know, we got to look at the this recent skirmish with Russia-Ukraine came kind of on the closing ceremonies of the Olympics in China. Yeah. You know, I think they wanted to let China have the Olympics. And China's reaction to the latest news was a big nothing burger. So part of this transition to a multipolar world, obviously, Russia and China would be one block. And that's part of the multipolar world that we're talking about. Now, you know, what's interesting is you talk to people in the U.S. and to a degree people in the U.K., and they seem to be fairly ambivalent about what's going on with Russia and Ukraine because, of course, this kerfuffle that's going on in Eastern Europe gives remarkable cover for the Fed and other central banks not to raise rates. Because, as you know, you can't taper a Ponzi. It seems like they were looking for an excuse not to raise rates. In fact, they're looking for an excuse to lower rates. So there's a lot of ambivalence about this. Even though the headlines are hysterical, the actual bankers that run the world are like, oh, thank God. Craig.
Yeah. Well, and actually, that was the genesis of that title this year for my, what I call it, macrocast, the reality bites. And the reality is going to bite the bankers and everybody that believes them. Because we've heard this, I don't know how many times before, Max, 3 or 4 times, at least a couple of times since the financial crisis. You know, remember Bernanke famously said in 2009, oh, no, we're not monetizing the debt. Wait a second, you're printing new cash and buying treasuries. How is that not monetizing the debt? But then it was going to be, QE was just a one-off. Oh, we're never going to do this again. And the balance sheet will go back to $1 trillion and all that kind of stuff. But we knew in March of 2009, once you head down this path, there's no going back. And think of it as like a series of higher or lower highs on a chart, Max. You know, they were able to run the 10-year treasury up in 2009 and 10 and got to a certain level and everything got all tight. And here came QE2 and the veil was pulled back and you could see that, you know, they really were just spinning lies and illusions. Then you got to 2015 and 18, they tried it again, but the 10-year treasury got to about 3% and the stock market crashed and they had to have a Christmas Eve meeting of the plunge protection team to try to rescue it. And that's what was the Powell pivot. What are they going to get to this? They haven't even started raising rates yet. Well, what's a 10-year note brushing up against 2%? And, you know, and all of a sudden, all the wheels are already starting to come off. I mean, people are talking about recession next year and a policy error. I mean, it's been revealed that that it's all nonsense. And as that revelation occurs to the global markets, whether it was in 2010-11 or whether it again in 2019 and 20, that's usually when, at least in what my concern is with gold, that's usually when it soars. People, you know, sit back and go, wait a second, they've been lying to us this whole time. And that's the reality that's setting in again here this year.
Right. If you show that chart to a bunch of Americans, they'll say, oh, great, credit's cheap. I'm going to go out and buy a lot of stuff and expand my credit card debt. You show that same chart to Russia and Russians, they'll be like, oh my God, the dollar's going to collapse. We need to buy gold. Okay, so who was right, who was wrong? Well, it's a little early to tell, but based on preliminary indications, it looks like there's not much anybody can do with a country that's already been sanctioned, owns hundreds and hundreds of tons of gold, thousands of tons of gold, and is getting ready to launch Bitcoin and demand payment for their gas in Bitcoin. There's really nothing anybody can do. Now, as we pointed out, they've got 600 billion in reserves now. Really not any dollars. And the Bitcoin thing's on the horizon. And so US dollar has been weaponized, right? I mean, the US turned off SWIFT for Iran. They're threatening to turn off SWIFT for Russia. But to add to some more color here, Craig, it looks like US dollar's global payments rail is about to end as well, Craig.
Certainly does, Max. And again, this de-dollarization theme is something that used to be tinfoil hat stuff, right? They're like, oh yeah, you're crazy. And that was usually the tinfoil hat stuff came from people that I guess had no understanding of history. They think tomorrow is always just going to be just like yesterday. But the U.S., I guess would call it that exorbitant privilege of being the reserves currency of the world, has only been since the end of World War II. And there were other countries that had that privilege before the U.S. I mean, it's a temporary thing. And the history, I guess, I don't know, maybe a lot of people haven't studied it, but the history is that in a monetary system, to get confidence, to get people to use your currency, you usually back it with something. In the old days, it used to be gold. In the near future, maybe gold again, and maybe Bitcoin, something that is a store of value. And you back it with that so that you have confidence in it. And then as, the backing fails, Nixon famously suspended the convertibility of the dollar into gold in 1971. As that backing fails, the politicians, the bankers just print more and more and more of it to the point where it becomes worthless and people lose confidence. Okay, so what happens? How do you get confidence again? Well, the pendulum swings back all the way to the other side, where an alternative is offered again that's backed by something, and people have more confidence in that. And so I don't have any doubt, we've talked about this now for over a decade, that that's the direction it's headed, whether it comes out of the East, whether it's some combination, Russia, China, some new currency that people feel more comfortable and confident in using than all these Western fiat. I'm not sure what it'll be and what it'll be backed by, but I just know eventually history suggests that's where we're headed.
Right. Well, let's talk about gold here. So the story of gold is actually two stories. And one story is gold priced in everything except the US dollar. And for every currency that's not the US dollar, gold is doing great. It's maintaining purchasing power. It's allowing people to escape the inflation and the hyperinflation that's happening in countries all over the world. It's doing great against the euro, against the pound, against the yen, against yuan. Then you have the story of US priced in the world reserve currency, the US dollar. And if you look at a chart, it looks like it's not really doing much. But that gets back to what we're saying here. If in fact we go from a unipolar world of US dollar world reserve currency to a multipolar world, will that not remove the shackles on gold price in US dollar terms, Craig?
Yeah, Max, it actually reminds me a little bit of 2 years ago, in that gold priced in all these other currency was breaking out to new all-time highs, but it hadn't done so in the dollar yet. And a lot of us that follow, gold, we sat back and well, it must just be an eventuality that's going to happen. And then by the summer of 2020, within a couple of months, it exploded and went all the way to whatever, $2,100 an ounce. The interesting thing about this current consolidation, and this is, I guess, true of just about anything, the longer something consolidates, the more obvious it becomes as to what the levels are that it's breaking out. It's like right now, everybody's looking at, wow, if gold holds above 1900 and then gets above 1920, wow, oh, look, it's higher than it was, a year ago. And everybody, the longer that period lasts, the more obvious those levels are. And then you start to generate some positive momentum and a change of sentiment. And that's why, again, I think as we go through this year, we'll probably exceed those 2020 highs, but it's never going to be easy in gold. Gold was financialized, as I like to call it, by all the banks and the central banks back in the 70s. And there's all these forms of synthetic gold that are accepted as the real thing. whether it's futures contracts or unallocated accounts or ETFs or whatever, there's all this synthetic gold that people accept as the real thing that dilutes the actual supply. And so as long as that system persists, it always makes it really hard, especially for dollar price gold to explode. But we'll see. We're making some progress on that end too, Max. Again, it's going to be such a tumultuous year that it'll be fun to watch.
Right. Well, this is fascinating. I'm going to have to carry you over for a second segment, Craig, if you can hang on. But thanks for being on this segment of the Keiser Report.
Hey, thanks for having me, Max. Always good to see you.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. Want to thank our guest, Craig Hemke of the TFMetalsReport.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.